Hi there, assessment students. It's Dr. Ryder, and I am bringing you interlude number 1, Assessment Ethics, Part 1. So here we go. So when we talk about assessment ethics, it's probably important first to maybe establish a definition of ethics, so Tim and Lloyd, who are two folks who have written about assessment and particularly doing some writing around assessment for assessment leaders in higher education and student affairs, offer an operational definition that ethics are the processes that we use to distinguish right from wrong, or to substitute appropriate actions for inappropriate ones. So trying to make sure that we make appropriate decisions or correct or right decisions in an ethical sense. And when it comes to assessment, this idea of distinguishing right from wrong and appropriate from inappropriate can affect and can be part of each phase of the assessment process. You're currently in the planning phase, and though you may not realize it, there are some important ethical considerations for you to be focusing on right now, even as you contemplate the assessment process. And the plans that you're making. There are clearly, and I think we tend to think most readily about ethics in the process of data collection, and we'll touch on that a little bit here, certainly too, even though that's still coming up in terms of the project. And then there are also considerations in terms of analysis and reporting. And I'll speak just briefly about analysis at the end of the video. And reporting and the use of assessment data is a topic that we'll cover later in the semester when we kind of get to that particular point in the project, because there are some interesting ethical considerations there that some of you may encounter in your project and in your process. So assessment ethics in the planning phase. It's important to keep in mind that you want to make sure that your assessment stays focused on important goals relative to that thing which you are assessing, whether it's a program like UNC Weekends or it's more of a needs-based assessment such as that being done out of and with the Student Health Center. You want to make sure that you're staying focused on important goals that matter to the assessment as well as to the topic that you're assessing. So that actually helps to keep the project fairly focused and fairly constrained so that it doesn't become something that's so big, but it's also one that guides the planning stage and the kinds of questions that you're going to be asking for your overall overarching assessment questions, as well as the kinds of questions that you might ask as part of data collection of people who might be responding to you. You want to ask them things that are important and relevant to the study. As an ethical issue, asking a lot of unnecessary kind of tangential questions, kind of to, tacking things on, uses additional time for individuals. It also kind of tends to water down the purpose and the sense of focus in the assessment. But it's important to stay focused on what's actually important in terms of the assessment. Actively involve those with the stake in the results in the planning phase. So, in the spirit of transparency, which we're going to talk about here on the next bullet, but also in making sure that you're getting good input and good information from other folks around you who have a stake or some skin in the game here. Make sure that you include them in the process. We all know what it's like to feel like someone has made some decisions or kind of done something relative to something that we care about, but maybe they don't consult us in doing so. And we don't want to make sure that, or we want to make sure rather that we do that in assessment, that we avoid that sort of kind of, avoiding stakeholders because, we don't necessarily want them to gum up the works. We want to make sure that we have an inclusive process. Practice transparency of purpose and process. So, understand and know what the purpose of your assessment is, and hopefully in your client meetings that's something that you're working on and beginning to have a better understanding of, and make sure that when you talk to those stakeholders in the previous bullet that they understand what the purpose of the assessment is, and in being transparent and in kind of sharing this information, it also helps you stick with that particular purpose, as the next bullet is actually going to say. But you're also being transparent in terms of the process. If you say that you're going to be sampling a certain group of students, or doing data collection within a certain time frame, or different measures that you're taking to keep data secure or whatnot, you need to honor that particular process, what you say you're going to do. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't make changes and adjustments. It simply means that if you do have to make changes and adjustments, that you're transparent about it, and you're transparent about the reasons why. So transparency, an important value, I think, in many things, and certainly in the ethical planning of assessment. And as I mentioned previously, sticking to the purpose, not kind of saying that you're doing an assessment for one reason, to understand students' learning in a particular program, and then on the back end, utilizing the data and framing the data from an assessment, so as to paint a negative picture about an individual within an organization, to use it for a job action against them, or for some other purposes that may not exactly be true or ethical, in the sense that it's not what you kind of initially set out to do. Now, it doesn't mean that kind of stuff doesn't happen. We'll talk about that on the back end in part 2 later in the semester, about some of these political and ethical issues that arise in the use of assessment data. But as an ideal and as something that's ethical practice, we want to make sure that we stick to the purpose of assessment. There are those things that we can control, and then sometimes there are some things that we can't, and therein can be some of the ethical issues, but we'll talk about that later on. When is assessment also research? A couple of you are working on projects where an IRB application should be submitted, and one of the reasons why others don't need to do that is because it's what you're doing really and truly is for internal purposes only. And so if you look at the Institutional Review Board and Human Subjects website here at UNCW, you'll find on the right-hand side this listing of documents or websites. And one is is the definition of research met in this activity. So all of you are doing something that looks like this. Is this activity a systematic investigation? Yes, that's true for all of you. And including research development, testing, and evaluation. Let's get back there. Okay, fine, yeah, maybe not. And then this third point, is it designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge? That really is where most of the projects in the course, and typically all of the projects in the semester, kind of don't then meet this definition of research. But the project related to student hygiene and the project related to the climate for students with disabilities both might wind up going someplace beyond UNCW. So if we kind of look further down this chart here, we can say, well, no, it's not. It doesn't meet this definition. Is there a chance that this activity will lead to a publication, or will the results be archived or presented in a professional forum? And that's where this may occur with both of those particular projects here under the yes column. So we have to determine then if human subjects are involved. If so, you may want to consider seeking IRB approval for this activity. It's interesting to me that they say you may want to consider, because my understanding of this process is you do. And without having an IRB, of course, it would not be necessarily the most ethical thing to do to then present and share that data. So kind of keep this in mind, that assessment can sometimes be research, and it really just kind of depends upon looking at a chart like this, which many institutions will provide you, and you can check out the IRB and Human Subjects Research website at UNCW to learn more about this if you'd like to read it. And there you go, kind of putting the particular part of our process there in the square. Assessment ethics and planning and data collection. So you no doubt in EDL 523, research and education, learned about some ethics related to research. And even though we kind of tend to think of those in the research context and whether your project has an IRB or not, these are still very important things to keep in mind. When we talk about respecting autonomy, we're talking about ensuring that the people who are participating in our assessments are doing so voluntarily, and that we permit them to say, see you later, this isn't really for me, and beg out, if they want to at any particular point in the process. They can stop taking the survey, they can leave the focus group, or what have you. And sometimes this is a challenging thing for people who do assessment work, because we've got so much technology these days that tracks students' movement with card swipes, data location on cell phones, social media, those kinds of things. And so we have to really keep in mind that this value of respecting autonomy is important, and it's important to conducting ethical research as well as ethical assessment. Do no harm, ensuring that those who participate don't experience any sort of negative impacts as a result of their participation or their data being collected. We want to make sure that, if it's not necessary, that we don't collect identifying information, and that if there are any sort of negative events that occur that might produce the need for counseling, such as a trigger that occurs for someone, that we provide follow-up for those sorts of services. And then, making sure perhaps that whatever incentives that we might provide, and it would be another consideration, aren't of the kind of nature that would be harmful to students. So that's an explanation for the reason why we don't have gift cards to venues that serve alcohol. And we might even think about providing incentives that clearly benefit students, or kind of offer a benefit to them that they can enjoy on campus. So do no harm. Should benefit others. All data collecting should be done with the intent of increasing knowledge, awareness, or improvement. So we want to make sure that the things that we're doing in terms of collecting assessment data are beneficial. That we're just, we treat participants fairly, we make sure that resources are shared appropriately, and we give equal access to participants to final results, making sure that there's an opportunity for them to maybe know what happened. That's something that we don't necessarily always do a very good job of. And this is a reminder to me, and that we don't do a very good job of it with respect to the course. We kind of leave that up to the clients. So kind of something to think about and to keep in mind for me, as well as for you guys. And then being faithful, staying true to the original purpose of the project. So again, this idea of, understanding and knowing the purpose and then following it. So your responses will be anonymous and confidential. I'm not as concerned about this, because I think you guys are smart enough to know that you don't guarantee what you can't deliver. And anonymity and confidentiality are tricky in an assessment and in a research setting, because if you're doing focus groups, obviously that's not anonymous. People might not necessarily know the name or remember the name of the person they were in the focus group with. But it's a small campus and you see people running around. And it certainly isn't confidential. And so the best that we can do is to encourage and ask that people kind of keep what's said in a focus group setting within that particular setting. Interviews, we might be able to keep keep that information confidential kind of between us and the person that we're talking to. But, anonymity, someone sees the person going to the interview site. There's no way of really kind of guaranteeing, anonymity, really kind of because of that. If someone knows that they're there for an interview to talk to someone about a particular topic, is that likely, and is it likely to be negatively impactful? Probably not, but something to keep in mind about where you choose and when you choose to have interviews with people, so that it's done in a location where people can be discreet if they need to be. And then in online surveys, they're quite secure, but we also understand that IP addresses aren't necessarily anonymous, unless, of course, it's on a public computer with a link that's not personalized. But even then, it just seems to me that there can be ways that people can track, online activity, and perhaps that's me just being cynical, and it probably is. Confidentiality, yes, for the most part, as long as the information isn't identifiable. But I think it's best to assume that there's not full 100% security in anything at this particular point anymore. Data security and ethics. So file sharing, please make sure that you're not careless and you kind of share only with people in your group. Use passwords, use strong passwords. Don't discuss data in public, and don't leave data lying around. And that's it.